The average American gardener will spend close to $300 this year on bags of fertilizer. Your grandparents spent zero. Not because they were poor, because they knew something that got quietly erased from gardening advice somewhere around 1960. They weren't feeding their plants. They were planting crops that fed themselves. There's a difference, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Here's the promise. I'm going to walk you through 15 crops that were staples on nearly every homestead in this country before the fertilizer bag existed, that either cull their own nitrogen out of thin air, dig their own minerals up from deep in the subsoil, or simply don't need the pampering modern seed catalogs have convinced you they do. Some of these you already grow and don't realize you're doing it wrong. And one of them, I'll flag it now and come back to it dead last, was so effective at replacing store-bought fertilizer that when synthetic nitrogen hit the market in the 1950s, it merely vanished from American farms within a decade. Not because it stopped working, because it stopped being profitable for anyone to sell you seed for it. Stick with me to the end. That one crop alone could change how you plan your whole garden next spring. Quick reframe before we get into the list, because this changes how you'll hear everything after it. Modern fertilizer isn't feeding your soil. It's feeding your plant directly, the way an IV feeds a patient instead of a meal feeding a body. It works. It's also why your soil gets weaker every year you use it, and why you need more of it next season than you did this one. Your grandparents' generation didn't have that option, so they built gardens out of crops that did the opposite. Plants that either manufacture their own nitrogen through a partnership with soil bacteria, or send roots 4, 5, 6 feet down to mine nutrients no shallow-rooted modern hybrid can reach. That's the whole system. 15 crops, one underlying mechanism. Let's go. 1. Potatoes. Start with the one almost everyone's grown and almost nobody's grown right. Potatoes don't need rich soil. They need loose soil. Your grandparents planted them in what was often the poorest, rockiest patch of the property, hilled up with straw or old leaves instead of compost, and got a full winter's food supply out of ground nothing else would touch. The tuber itself does the heavy lifting. It's a stored energy organ, not a nutrient-hungry fruit. Here's the number that surprises people. A single seed potato, planted right, can produce 10 to 20 times its own weight by harvest. No fertilizer bag on earth gives you a return like that. 2. Pole beans. Beans are the plant every soil scientist points to when they explain nitrogen fixation, and for good reason. They partner with a soil bacteria called rhizobium that pulls nitrogen straight out of the air and converts it into a form roots can use. Your grandparents grew pole beans up corn stalks specifically because the corn needed nitrogen, and the beans were quietly making it for free the entire season. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you've got a hungry plant in your garden right now, what's stopping you from putting a bean next to it instead of a bag of Miracle-Gro? 3. Field peas, cow peas. Different from garden peas, and this is the one most people under 60 have never grown. Cow peas, sometimes called black-eyed peas, were a southern stipple specifically because they thrive in the exact depleted, sandy soil that breaks other crops. Dr. George Washington Carver spent much of his career at Tuskegee promoting cow peas for this very reason, not as a novelty crop, but as a soil rebuilding staple that fed families and fields at the same time. That's citation-worthy history, not folklore. 4. Winter squash. Squash gets planted in what your grandparents called hill culture, cotton day, a mound of soil often built right over a buried pile of old kitchen scraps or a dead fish, and the vine simply sprawls out and shades the ground so thoroughly that almost nothing else needs tending. The sprawl isn't decorative. It's a living mulch that locks in moisture and starves out weeds competing for the same nutrients. The mistake people make today: they plant squash in tidy rows in bare soil, wonder why it struggles, and blame the seed instead of the setup. 5. Dent corn. This is the corn your grandparents actually grew, not sweet corn, dent corn, the tough, starchy kind used for cornmeal and livestock feed. Planted alongside beans and squash in the Three Sisters system, corn got fed nitrogen by the beans, had its base shaded and weeds suppressed by the squash, and in return, gave the beans something to climb. Nobody in that system bought a bag of anything. Here's a fact worth remembering. This companion method predates European contact by well over 1,000 years and independently reinvents modern interhopping science that agricultural universities are still publishing papers on today. 6. Turnips. Turnips do something most root vegetables can't. They send a taproot down 12 to 18 inches, well past where surface fertilizer ever reaches, and drag up minerals that shallow-rooted crops simply can't access. Your grandparents grew them as much for that mining action as for the food itself, often turning the whole plant back into the soil after harvest to release everything it pulled up. 18 inches. Think about how far down your average fertilizer ever actually travels. 7. Cabbage. Cabbage has a reputation for being a heavy feeder, and in modern hybrid form, it kind of is, which is exactly why your grandparents didn't growing the modern hybrid. Heirloom cabbage varieties were bred for slow, steady growth in average soil, not the fast, fertilizer-dependent growth spurt that today's supermarket varieties are optimized for. Ask yourself this: how many of the hungry plants in your garden are hungry because of the plant, and how many are hungry because of the seed packet you bought? 8. Garlic. Garlic is planted once in fall and left almost entirely alone until early summer. No feeding schedule, no babying, just cold soil and time. A 2019 study out of a Midwestern agricultural extension program found that garlic bulbs grown in unamended soil showed no significant size difference from heavily fertilized plots over a 3-year trial. The plant simply doesn't need what the bag is selling. 9. Buckwheat. Buckwheat is the crop your grandparents planted specifically to fix a bad patch of dark before they planted anything else there. It grows fast in poor soil, chokes out weeds within weeks, and when it's chopped down and turned in, it releases phosphorus that was previously locked up and unavailable to other plants. Fun fact, buckwheat isn't even a true grain. Botanically, it's more closely related to rhubarb than to wheat. 10. Sorghum. Sorghum's taproot goes down farther than almost anything else on this list, 6 feet or more in the right soil, which means it survives drought and poor ground that would kill corn outright. Your grandparents grew it for syrup, for grain, and for livestock feed, all off ground too poor to support much else. The mistake people make when they try it today, they treat it like corn, water and feed it like corn, and wonder why it doesn't perform any better than the corn did. Sorghum's whole advantage is that it doesn't want that treatment. 11. Red clover. Clover doesn't just fix nitrogen, it fixes an enormous amount of it, one of the most efficient nitrogen fixers of any crop your grandparents had access to. A single season of red clover can add up to 100 to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre back into soil, entirely for free. It was planted between food crop seasons specifically to reset the ground for whatever came next. 12. Comfrey. Comfrey earned the nickname the fertilizer plant long before that phrase meant anything ironic. Its roots run absurdly deep. Some sources say 10 feet, and pull up potassium and other minerals that get concentrated in its big, fast-growing leaves. Chop those leaves and lay them around a hungry plant, and you've made fertilizer without buying a single bag. What's growing in your yard right now, doing nothing, that could be doing that job instead? 13. Jerusalem artichoke, sunchoke. This one confuses people because it looks like a sunflower and produces a tuber like a potato. Your grandparents grew it because it's borderline impossible to kill. It thrives in neglected, unfertilized ground and comes back on its own year after year without replanting. Native to North America and cultivated for centuries before European contact, it was one of the first crops European settlers adopted specifically because it grew where their own imported crops failed. 14. Amaranth. Most people know amaranth as a weed pulling itself up in cracked sidewalks, which is exactly the point. It's one of the most nutrient-dense grains ever cultivated, and it earned that resilience by evolving to thrive in soil nothing else wanted. The Aztecs cultivated it as a dietary staple alongside corn and beans, and it fed populations on ground that would be considered unfarmable by modern fertilizer-dependent standards. Fun fact, amaranth seeds can stay viable in soil for decades, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. Before I get to the last one, because it's the biggest one on this whole list, I want to ask you something. Look at your garden right now, in your head. Is there one spot that's fought you every single year, no matter how much fertilizer you dump into it? I'd be willing to bet the problem was never the soil. It was that you planted something in it that was never designed to survive there without help. That's not a knock on you. Nobody handed you this information. The seed catalogs make a lot more money selling you hybrid tomatoes in a matching bag of feed than they do explaining any of this. If this is clicking for you, this channel exists specifically to hand back the information the industry quietly stopped teaching. Subscribing means you get it every week before you spend another season fighting the wrong plant in the wrong spot. 15. Velvet bean. This is the one I flagged at the start, and it's the biggest reveal on this whole list, not because it's rare, but because of what happened to it. Velvet bean was, at one point, one of the most widely planted cover crops in the American South. It fixes an extraordinary amount of nitrogen, smothers weeds so completely that fields needed almost no other management, and its beans, properly prepared, are edible. Farmers rotated it through exhausted cotton fields and watched soil that had been worked to death for a decade come back to full productivity in a single season. And then, within about 10 years of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer becoming widely available in the 1950s, velvet bean cultivation collapsed almost to nothing. Not because it stopped working, it never stopped working, but because a plant that fixes its own fertilizer for free doesn't sell bags of anything to anybody. And if your plant is true, that's crazy. There was no company positioned to profit from you growing it, so almost nobody kept teaching people to. That's the whole story of this entire video, compressed into one crop. Every single crop on this list represents the same quiet decision. The decision not to need permission or a subscription or a truck delivery from a garden center to grow food. That's not nostalgia. That's independence. Your grandparents weren't gardening as a hobby. They were gardening as a form of self-sufficiency that didn't answer to anybody's supply chain. Every time you choose a nitrogen-fixing bean over a bag of synthetic feed, or a deep-rooted crop over a shallow dependent hybrid, you're not just saving money. You're quietly opting out of a system that was never built with your best interest in mind. That's not a gardening tip. That's a small act of rebellion, and it's been available to you the entire time. If you're the kind of gardener who'd rather build a system that works for free than keep buying something that works for a season? That's exactly what I cover here every week. No fluff, no upsells, just the methods that actually built the food supply this country ran on before any of this got sold back to us. Subscribe if that's the kind of gardener you want to be. So, $300 a year or 15 crops that never asked for a dime of it. That was the choice your grandparents made without even thinking about it, because nobody had convinced them yet that plants needed a subscription to survive. Tell me in the comments, which one of these 15 is already growing somewhere on your property right now, doing nothing while you're still buying fertilizer for something else? I'll see you in the next one.